Picture this, I am deep diving through the archives when I stumble upon the track Love Is Everything, and I just have to pause and say that title isn't just a lyric, it is the absolute truth, because at the end of the day, love really is the whole game. We are talking about a reign that has lasted longer than most Hollywood marriages combined. For over 3 decades, George Strait didn't just participate in the country music scene, he practically owned the deed to it. While other artists were chasing fleeting trends, changing their sound like they change outfits and fading into obscurity, Strait stood like an immovable mountain, owning a lane that was raw, honest and completely untouchable. But even legends have to face the music eventually, and for years there has been this nagging question whispering through the hallways of Nashville. What exactly happens when the king of country decides to hang up his hat for good? Would the entire empire crumble, or are the roots deep enough to keep the dynasty alive without him on the throne? Before we spill the tea on the future of the Strait family legacy and the bombshell confirmation we finally got from his son, we need to rewind the tape and analyse the man behind the myth, the rocky road he travelled, and the brutal realities that sculpted his private world. This isn't a story of overnight fame. This is a man raised by the unforgiving Texas heat and shaped by a quiet stoic strength that you just don't see anymore. George Harvey Strait made his grand entrance on May 18th, 1952 in the tiny dust-covered town of Petite, Texas, a place where the pace is slow and reputation is built on sweat equity, not cheap talk. He spent his formative years in Pearsall, deep in the heart of Frio County, just southwest of San Antonio, where the endless skies, gritty back roads and the harsh realities of ranch life painted the background of his entire childhood. His father, John Byron Strait Sr., was juggling a double life of his own, working as a junior high math teacher by day while managing a massive 200-acre cattle operation outside Big Wells, Texas. From the moment he could walk, George was learning the ropes, and let me tell you, he learned responsibility through back-breaking labour, not through gentle lectures or timeouts. You can forget about lazy weekends or carefree summer vacations. Those luxuries simply did not exist in the Strait household. Those days were dedicated to wrangling cattle, mending broken fences and understanding the brutal lesson of showing up to work, even when you are exhausted and the heat is unbearable. These grueling years quietly installed a level of discipline and humility in him that would eventually become his trademark in a business famous for egos and tantrums. But here is where the story gets heartbreaking. While George was still just an elementary school kid, his parents went through a shattering divorce that completely redefined their family dynamic forever. His mother packed up and moved away, leaving George and his brother behind to be raised solely by their father, growing up under his steady military-style guidance. Life didn't get any easier for the young future star. If anything, it became more rigid, structured, and devoid of the soft comforts other kids enjoyed. The endless cycle of ranch work filled the empty spaces where a mother's comfort might have been, and a heavy silence often took the place of emotional conversations. Yet it was precisely inside this pressure cooker that George developed that famous icy demeanour, his grounded soul, and the instinct to let his actions scream louder than his words ever could. These were the very traits that would later make him a unicorn in an industry obsessed with flashy gimmick scandals and desperate self-promotion. Now, unlike the fairy tales, music didn't burst into George Strait's life with fireworks and applause. It crept in through the back door, almost like a happy accident during his high school years when he linked up with a garage rock band called the Stoics. Like every other rebellious teen of that era, he wasn't tuning into twangy country stations. He was obsessed with the British invasion, vibing to the Beatles and the rock gods ruling the charts. But something about that rock star life didn't quite click with his soul. George wasn't the type of kid glued to the radio waiting for the top 40 countdown. Believe it or not, he was more likely to be listening to the news or boring farmers' crop reports, soaking in the rhythm of real Texas life instead of chasing the latest pop culture fad. His real education in country music happened in the wild at live gigs, sweaty dance halls and local town gatherings where the music wasn't auto-tuned, it was lived and breathed. Slowly but surely, his musical palette began to evolve. He found himself pulling away from the noise and gravitating toward artists who were storytellers, singers, who didn't chase trends but delivered raw emotion without all the theatrical excess. Legends like Hank Williams, Merle Haggard, George Jones, Bob Wills and Lefty Frizzell started to carve out his new identity, mixing that classic Western swing with honky-tonk grit and traditional country to create a sound that felt painfully honest and deeply authentic. This wasn't just him playing copycat, it was total absorption. As George wasn't trying to mimic a sound, he was living it. He was quietly building a style that was a mirror image of his roots, his values, and his unique perspective on the world around him. Flash forward to a year before he nearly walked away from it all. By the time George hit college, music wasn't just a hobby anymore. It was a magnetic force pulling at him from the inside, even if he was too stubborn or practical to admit it out loud to anyone. He signed up for classes at Southwest Texas State University in San Marcos with plans to study agriculture, a safe, sensible choice. It was a path that fit perfectly with his ranching background, and let's be honest, probably kept his father happy. At this point in the saga, music was still just a side piece, something personal he kept in his back pocket rather than a career goal. But destiny has a funny way of interfering, and everything changed because of a simple overlooked flyer stapled to a campus bulletin board. A local country band was desperate for a singer, and let me tell you, there was zero glitz involved, no promise of fame, no fortune, just an open mic. George answered that ad on a whim, completely unaware that this tiny, seemingly insignificant decision was about to rewrite music history forever. The band was named Stony Ridge, and the second he stepped up to that microphone, the chemistry was undeniable. It was electric. For the first time in his life, Strait wasn't just singing songs, he was discovering his true voice and unleashing a power he didn't know he had. As his confidence skyrocketed, Stony Ridge transformed into something legendary. He rebranded the group Ace in the Hole, and before anyone knew it, he had taken his rightful place as the leader of the pack. They were hustling hard, playing literally anywhere that would open the doors for them. We are talking about smoke-filled dive bars, gritty dance halls, and tiny nightclubs scattered all over South and Central Texas. They were driving for hours just to scrape together enough cash for gas and a greasy meal. The glitz and glam of fame were absolutely nowhere in sight, but the music was raw and real, and the crowds were definitely starting to get bigger. The band's local buzz earned them some sweet gigs opening for legends like the Texas Playboys, and eventually they caught the eye of a small indie label down in Houston. That label gave them a shot to cut a few singles, including some tracks that George had penned himself. For the first time ever, his voice was pressed onto vinyl, but the industry bigwigs, they barely even batted an eyelash. The records flopped hard, radio stations treated them like poison, and that dream of national stardom remained painfully out of reach. So by day, George was out there sweating it out, working cattle on his family's ranch just to pay the bills. By night, he was singing his heart out to crowds who adored him, but sadly, adoration doesn't pay the rent or change your life. The dream was hanging by a thread, but then a glimmer of drama and hope appeared in the form of bar owner Irv Woolsey, a guy with connections from his days at MCA Records. Woolsey believed in George's star power enough to drag some record executives all the way from Nashville to see the magic live. They showed up, they listened, they acted impressed, and then they brutally walked away. The reason was simple and absolutely devastating. They claimed they couldn't market his sound. His traditional Western vibe just didn't mesh with the plastic pop country trends that were taking over the industry. Nashville decided George Strait was simply too country. This was the year everything flipped upside down. After years of door slams and rejection, the bitterness was really setting in. George reached his breaking point. He was tired, discouraged, and convinced the industry hated him, so he dropped a bombshell on his band. He was quitting music for good. Ranching offered a steady paycheck. Music seemed to offer nothing but heartbreak and frustration. But then his wife Norma stepped in like the hero of this story. She didn't give him a long speech or fake promises. She gave him a gentle ultimatum: give it one more year, just one final shot. If he failed, he could walk away with his head held high. That 1 year changed the game forever. In February 1981, George Strait inked a deal with MCA Records. But don't get too excited, the label was playing it safe. They agreed to release exactly one single. If it was a hit, maybe they would talk about an album. If it flopped, that was it. Game over. But when MCA dropped Unwound, the reaction was absolute chaos. The song skyrocketed to number 6 on the Billboard Hot Country Songs chart. It was a massive slap in the face to the doubters for a debut artist with zero pop crossover appeal. Suddenly, George Strait wasn't a liability, he was the next big thing. They rushed his debut album, Strait Country, and critics were falling over themselves calling it a breakthrough. At a time when country music was selling out to pop, Strait's sound felt like a glorious return to the roots. It was authentic, unpolished, and brutally honest. Country music had finally found its saviour. This was the decade that crowned a king. When Strait Country dropped, it did way more than just launch a career. It quietly signalled a massive shift in the entire direction of country music. It arrived right when the genre was drowning in glossy production and cheesy pop sounds. George Strait's music stood out not because he was trying to be trendy, but because he refused to chase the fame game at all. His voice had soul rather than theatrics, and his songs felt like real life instead of some manufactured product. That is exactly why critics and fans instantly recognised Strait Country as a rare gem, a throwback that felt real, not just nostalgic. He kept that momentum burning with Straight from the Heart in 1982, an album that proved he was no one-hit wonder. With Fool-Hearted Memory hitting number 1 and Amarillo by Morning becoming the anthem that defined his entire persona. It wasn't loud or flashy, but the quiet storytelling hit people right in the feels, proving that you don't need to scream and shout to be powerful. George Strait wasn't trying to reinvent the wheel. He was just reminding everyone how good the ride could be when you strip it down to the basics. Then, in 1983, fate intervened with a juicy twist. A headliner got sick at the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo and George was asked to step in. That last-minute decision became one of the most legendary chapters in his celebrity biography. What started as a frantic replacement gig turned into a tradition that lasted for decades. Strait kept coming back year after year, eventually racking up over 20 performances and playing to more than 1 million screaming fans. The rodeo wasn't just another stop on the tour bus. It became the ultimate symbol of his bond with Texas, with the working class, and with a culture that craves authenticity over Hollywood fakeness. Throughout the 1980s, the numbers were absolute insanity. We are talking 17 number 1 hits in a single decade. He went on a streak of consecutive chart toppers that basically told the rest of the industry to sit down and take notes. Albums like Right or... It was a complete takeover of the charts when Right or Wrong and Does Fort Worth Ever Cross Your Mind hit number 1 with the latter, snatching up the prestigious CMA Album of the Year trophy. But here is the wildest part of the story. While his fame was skyrocketing into the stratosphere, George Strait refused to sell his soul or change a single thing about his musical identity. You didn't see him desperate for attention with experimental phases or shocking makeovers. He just kept delivering hit after hit that felt gritty, real and refreshingly human in a plastic industry. While every other wannabe star was bending over backward to please the market, Strait stood his ground like a rock. And by doing absolutely nothing but being himself, he became the gold standard everyone else was chasing. This was the ultimate flex, massive superstardom with absolutely zero theatrical nonsense or desperate cries for attention. By the time the mid-1980s rolled around, George Strait had smashed through a glass ceiling that most artists only dream of entering, a legendary tier where he wasn't just a player in the country music game, he was the one writing the rules. The critics in the industry stopped trying to compare him to his rivals because, frankly, he was in a league entirely of his own. He had transformed into the ultimate benchmark, the icon that every newcomer was measured against when people argued about what real, authentic country music was supposed to look and sound like. The hardware started raining down on him naturally with trophies for CMA Male Vocalist of the Year and multiple Entertainer of the Year titles piling up on his mantle. But if you were looking for a diver moment or a massive ego trip, you wouldn't find it. None of the accolades seemed to put even a dent in his cool, calm demeanour. The massive fame didn't puff up his head or push him toward the flashy lifestyle. Instead, it seemed to lock him down even harder, reinforcing his gut instinct to stay humble and let the vinyl do the talking. When he stepped under the spotlight, Strait was almost rebellious in how understated he was, refusing to give the audience the circus act they were used to. His vocals were surgical and smooth, his movements barely there, and he commanded the entire arena without ever having to scream, "Look at me." There were no backup dancers, no explosions, and absolutely no rehearsed cheesy stage banter designed to manipulate the crowd. It was just a man, a microphone, and a stoic confidence, betting everything on the fact that the song itself was strong enough to hold the room captive. That gamble became his signature move. He didn't just sing at the fans, he pulled them into a private conversation, creating a vibe so intimate it felt scandalous in an era of over-the-top productions. Tracks like The Chair were the perfect example of this masterclass in seduction and storytelling. He showed the world he could break hearts and communicate deep emotion without a single ounce of drama, using the silence between the notes to build an unbearable amount of tension. While his competitors were blowing out their vocal cords and relying on pyrotechnics to distract the crowd, Strait was playing the long game with honesty and perfect timing, proving that what you hold back is often infinitely more powerful than what you scream. This mysterious, reserved approach didn't push people away. It made him feel like the only real person in a room full of fakes. The fans went absolutely feral for that authenticity, developing a cult-like loyalty that went far beyond casual fandom. In an era where your image and your scandals were becoming just as important as your talent, George Strait pulled a disappearing act, becoming nearly invisible the moment the music stopped. He was a ghost to the tabloids, dodging controversies, shutting down interview requests, and building a fortress around his private life. This wasn't some calculated PR move to make him seem brooding or mysterious for the magazines. He genuinely believed that once he stepped off that stage, his life belonged to him and him alone, not to the prying eyes of the public. That ironclad privacy didn't alienate anyone. It actually obsessed the fans, more convincing them that the man on the record was the exact same man in real life, with zero filter or facade. Despite having more money and fame than he could ever spend, Strait kept his boots firmly planted in the dirt of the life he knew before the glitz and glamour. He was always rushing back to Texas, running his ranch, and staying fiercely committed to his wife, Norma, keeping their union completely out of the gossip columns. Their marriage was built on a rock-solid foundation of respect and shared history, a quiet fortress against the industry madness. It stood in shocking contrast to the messy divorces and wild affairs that usually plague superstars, serving as proof that his values were bulletproof long before he became a legend. Even as his career hit dizzying heights that would make most people lose their minds, George Strait walked through the fire with the same cool, detached energy he had back when he was a nobody. He was still the guy working cattle with his dad, totally unimpressed by the flashbulbs, the parties, or the desperate need for validation. His eyes were locked on two things, and two things only: his family and his music. But behind that untouchable, steady exterior fate was sharpening a knife that would test his spirit in a way that no bad review or chart slump ever could. A nightmare was lurking just around the corner, ready to redefine his entire concept of strength in the most brutal, heartbreaking way possible. The tragedy that changed everything. Being on top of the world has a way of tricking you into thinking you are invincible and that nothing can touch you. But behind the platinum records, the sold-out tours, and the living legend status, George Strait was walking blindly toward a grief so shattering that no amount of money or fame could shield him from the blow. In 1986, right when he was sitting on the throne of country music reality, delivered a devastating strike that would permanently scar the man behind the guitar and change how he viewed the universe. Up until that horrific point, George Strait was the picture of unshakable calm and stability. He was the guy who had it all under control, carrying himself with a quiet swagger and emotional discipline. But there is absolutely nothing in this world that can prepare a father for the death of a child, and nothing he had faced before required that kind of survival instinct. On June 25th, 1986, the perfect world of George and Norma Strait was blown to pieces when their daughter Jennifer was killed in a catastrophic car accident at the tender age of 13. The shocking reports detailed a parent's worst nightmare, confirming that the vehicle she was a passenger in had overturned, silencing the music and shattering the family's heart. It happened in the blink of an eye. She was making a turn, unbuckled and vulnerable, without a seatbelt. In that split second, the picture-perfect happiness the family had so carefully constructed was shattered, replaced instantly by a grief so profound it defied any description. For George, the devastation was total, a living nightmare, and the voracious public would hear absolute silence from him regarding the tragedy. You wouldn't see him giving tearful, emotional interviews to boost ratings. He refused to seek cheap sympathy from the tabloids. He didn't offer a roadmap to his pain for the world to consume. Instead, he handled the crisis exactly as he handled everything else in his life. He built a fortress around his heart, retreating inward and aggressively choosing privacy over exposure, silence over the chaotic spectacle of celebrity grief. For years after the shocking death of Jennifer George, practically ghosted the media, agreeing to interviews only when contractually forced, and strictly refusing to let his personal hell become part of his public brand. The icon who sold out massive arenas night after night was walking around with a soul-crushing heartbreak that the screaming crowds could only guess at. And that ironclad restraint, rather than pushing people away, actually deepened his connection to the fans, creating a bond thicker than blood. The audiences in the stands could sense the heavy burden behind his quiet demeanour, feeling the tragedy radiating off him even if they didn't know the grim details. Although George Strait never spilled his guts about the pain, the agony bled into his music in subtle, unmistakable ways that true fans couldn't miss. Heavy themes of crushing lost longing and brutal endurance began to surface, not as dramatic weeping confessions, but as understated reflections that let listeners project their own dramas right onto his songs. He wasn't out there writing literal lyrics about the tragedy he was living, but the emotional gravity was undeniable, carried in the crack of his voice, the tone, and the agonising restraint. His catalogue became a sanctuary where sorrow and strength lived side by side, reminding everyone that love is precious, specifically because it can be snatched away, and time is a luxury, never a guarantee. Fans who had walked through their own fires of loss felt a secret, unspoken handshake with the superstar. They sensed that George wasn't just acting out emotions for a paycheck, he was surviving them every single day. Instead of vanishing from the industry entirely, Strait threw himself into the grind as a form of survival, using work not as a distraction, but as a lifeline of structure. The endless cycle of touring, recording and performing gave him a routine to cling to when his real life felt dangerously off its axis. And through that relentless schedule, he found a way to put one foot in front of the other without ever faking a smile or pretending the nightmare hadn't happened. In the dark years following Jennifer's death, George Strait became fiercely protective of his clan, drawing an iron line between his stardom and his private sanctuary. His marriage to Norma, already a rarity rooted in decades of history, transformed into his ultimate source of strength. Their bond was welded stronger by the grief rather than fractured by it. They chose to heal in the shadows, far away from flashing cameras and cruel commentary, preserving what mattered when the world felt upside down. Then there was their son, George Harvey Strait Jr., known to the inner circle as Bubba. He grew up practically invisible, shielded entirely from the blinding glare of the spotlight. He was raised with the same old-school code that shaped his father, heavy on humility, discipline, and a strict respect for privacy. George was militantly determined that the toxic cloud of fame would not define his family or dictate how they lived their lives. And despite being a living legend, he remained present, grounded, and shockingly ordinary when he was at home. This insane balance became one of the most defining, almost mythical aspects of his legacy. While other artists were selling their souls for their image, George Strait focused on being a husband and father, first treating music as just an extension of his life, rather than a replacement for it. That calculated choice, quiet and deliberate, saved not only his family, but preserved his own sanity and sense of self. Records, restraint, and a legacy carved in stone. As the years rolled on, George Strait pulled off a magic trick that is unheard of in the modern music industry. He kept racking up wins without changing a single thing, quietly giving the middle finger to the idea that longevity requires constant reinvention. While the country music scene around him morphed into pop crossovers with flashy production and desperate image-driven stardom, Strait stood his ground, releasing album after album that sounded unapologetically like him. His music felt grounded, familiar, and brutally honest in a sea of fakes. He didn't debase himself chasing radio trends or reshaping his identity just to stay relevant to the youth. Instead, relevance seemed to chase him, drawn in by the hypnotic consistency of his voice and the raw authenticity of his songs. His dominance never arrived in sudden viral explosions, but through a steady, crushing accumulation of wins year after year until his success was simply too massive to ignore. By the time the 1990s and early 2000s hit, the scale of George Strait's achievements had reached historically terrifying proportions. Number one hits were stacking up like firewood at a pace that felt almost boringly routine. Albums consistently smashed into gold and platinum status, and his name became the ultimate brand for reliability, quality, and endurance. What truly made him a unicorn wasn't just the sheer volume of his success, but his relentless persistence. He managed to land a top 10 hit every single year for 3 consecutive decades, a feat that is unmatched in any genre of music, period. In an industry defined by brutal cycles of rise and fall, where careers burn out in a blink, Strait simply endured, completely immune to changing tastes or industry pressure. Yet, despite holding records that put him at the same table as gods like Elvis Presley and the Beatles, when it came to his massive haul of gold and platinum certifications, George Strait never spoke or behaved like a man hungry for the history books. He treated those glittering awards and chart-topping positions as mere polite nods from the industry, never the ultimate destination for a superstar of his caliber. To him, they were just mile markers on a long highway, never the fuel that kept his engine running in a town desperate for validation. He remained obsessively fixated on the art of the song itself, completely ignoring the scoreboard that the rest of Nashville used to track his undeniable dominance. You see, success for a legend like Strait was never about proving his greatness to the critics or the haters. It was about keeping his integrity bulletproof, trusting the melody, and letting history, not the breathless hype machine, decide what was actually iconic. But let's look beyond the sold-out arenas, the silver screen moments, the quiet philanthropy, and those deep Texas roots. George Strait's influence bled way past the recording booth and the concert lights. Even though he refused to aggressively market himself or morph into a desperate multimedia personality like so many of his fame-hungry peers were doing at the time, his empire expanded organically, built on a foundation of fan trust, rather than some slick, overpriced PR campaign designed to trick the masses. So when he strutted onto the movie set in 1992 for Pure Country, it didn't feel like a desperate career pivot to stay relevant. It felt like a quiet, confident extension of the man we already knew. Stepping into the boots of Dusty Chandler, a country star sick of the fake fame game and desperate for something real, Strait seemed to be winking at the audience. He was practically blurring the lines between Hollywood fiction and his own reality, embodying a character whose distaste for the celebrity circus mirrored his own careful dance with stardom. This film was his golden ticket to play with a broader musical sound without turning his back on his traditional roots, a move that silenced the doubters instantly. The soundtrack, absolutely dripping with classic country vibes and Western themes, didn't just sell, it became one of the most commercially explosive releases of his entire career. It was the ultimate receipts-proving moment, showing that his appeal could cross over into any format while he stayed totally rooted in genuine sincerity. Far away from the flashing bulbs of the paparazzi, Strait's true character came out in the shadows through his dedication to causes he actually gave a damn about, specifically our military heroes and wounded vets. Having worn the uniform of the United States Army himself back in the day, he held a lifelong, unshakable respect for service and sacrifice, choosing to give back without the grand, self-congratulatory public gestures most stars crave. He preferred sustained, real action. Teaming up with his longtime ride-or-die friend and business partner Tom Cusick, he helped to launch an exclusive annual invitational golf tournament and concert bash deep in the Texas Hill Country. This wasn't just a party. It was a massive undertaking that quietly funneled millions of dollars to organisations saving soldiers and their families, all under the radar. Staying true to his low-key brand, these massive charitable power moves were rarely hyped by George, proving he believed generosity didn't need a hashtag to be real, and that impact was worth more than headlines. Despite having global fame that most people would kill for and a historic level of success, George Strait never pulled up stakes and left Texas in the rearview mirror. He stayed put, maintaining that rugged ranching lifestyle and clinging to a sense of normalcy that the chaos of celebrity culture could never quite destroy. He lived for the simple things: golf, steer, roping and breathing fresh air, which kept him balanced and grounded in the same rhythms that defined him long before he was a household name. These daily routines weren't just him hiding from his fame. They were vital reminders of the man he was underneath all the platinum records and sold-out signs. When George Strait dropped the bombshell news of his retirement from touring in 2012, it sent massive shockwaves through the industry, not because it was a scandal, but because it felt like the end of an era. This wasn't some dramatic exit caused by a breakdown or a decline in talent. It was a calculated boss move by a man who valued control over his own schedule, his priorities, and his pristine legacy. Make no mistake, he wasn't quitting music. He was simply rewriting the contract on how it fit into his life. His farewell tour, The Cowboy Rides Away, turned into a massive victory lap and a collective moment of emotional gratitude. It drew oceans of fans who showed up not just to scream the lyrics, but to pay homage to a career that had been the soundtrack to their lives for decades. The final curtain call at AT&T Stadium in Arlington, Texas, absolutely shattered attendance records, cementing itself as the most attended concert in North American history. It was the perfect send-off for an artist who always let the numbers and the applause speak way louder than any press release ever could. But even after walking away from the grueling road life, Strait never truly hit the brakes on his creativity. He kept the studio warm, releasing albums and picking his collaborations, carefully proving that retirement for him meant being present, not absent. It meant more quality time with the family, total control over his output, and the ultimate freedom to decide when he wanted to grace the world with his voice. And yet, quietly brewing behind the scenes, something else was beginning to take shape. It was something the die-hard fans had suspected for ages, but never had confirmed a continuation of the bloodline ready to step into the spotlight. The legacy refuses to die. For years, the question had been whispered in the VIP sections and backrooms of the country music scene. It was never asked too loudly out of respect for the king, but nobody could ignore the elephant in the room either. When George Strait finally hung up the hat, who on earth would have the guts to carry the spirit of pure country forward? Would the dynasty end with him frozen in time on vinyl and in memories, or had the torch already been passed under everyone's noses? As it turns out, the answer to that burning question had been standing right next to him all along. Despite being the son of the most worshipped country artist of his entire generation, Bubba was never forced into the fame machine or pushed toward the centre stage. While most celebrity offspring are busy flaunting their trust funds and chasing clout, the Strait heir was raised in a totally different reality. Fame wasn't handed over like a platinum credit card. It was strictly treated as something you had to earn. He grew up grounded by the exact same old-school values that built his father's empire: humility, severe discipline, and the rare freedom to carve out his own destiny without the pressure of the spotlight. And get this, that destiny didn't initially lead him to the recording booth or the stage. In a shocking twist for a music royal, he turned his back on the glamour and headed straight for the dust and danger of the rodeo arena. While attending Texas A&M University, Bubba didn't just dabble in the cowboy lifestyle for the aesthetic. He went deep undercover. He completely immersed himself in the brutal, bone-breaking world of competitive rodeo, far away from the prying eyes of the music industry. This wasn't a phase. He eventually went full pro, signing with the Professional Rodeo Cowboys Association and proving he was the real deal, not just a famous name playing dress-up. For years, he lived a grueling life on the road, travelling mile after unglamorous mile, competing and training like a beast. It was a lifestyle that demanded absolute grit, surgical precision, and a level of resilience that money simply cannot buy. Let's be clear, rodeo wasn't just a cute hobby for Bubba to talk about at cocktail parties. It was a full-blown obsession, a calling that aligned perfectly with the hardcore code of ethics he watched his father live by behind closed doors. Even when a catastrophic injury nearly ended his roping career forever, Bubba didn't run crying to his privilege or fall back on easy expectations. Instead, he did what survivors do. He adapted, quietly recalibrated his entire life and shifted his focus without making a single headline about his struggle. He carried a fierce, silent determination that proved the Strait bloodline was made of steel long before the world knew his name. But here is the juicy insider detail. Even while rodeo dominated his 20s, the music was never actually absent from Bubba's life. It was lurking in the background, a hidden passion. Years before the fandom even noticed him, his voice made a stealthy cameo. That is him you hear on the beginning of Heartland, the opening track of the pure country soundtrack. A whisper of an introduction rather than a desperate declaration of fame. As he matured, Bubba refused to pull the "do you know who my father is" card. He didn't launch a solo career with a massive PR blitz or a reality show. He played the long game, earning his spot gradually and working in the shadows as a songwriter. He was grinding behind the scenes, letting the work speak for itself. Over the years, the father-son duo was secretly cooking up magic in the studio. Bubba co-wrote a slew of tracks on major albums like Here for a Good Time, Love is Everything, Cold Beer Conversation, and the smash hit Honky Tonk Time Machine. Critics might have expected these to be vanity projects, just a dad throwing his kid a bone. But these weren't novelty collaborations or symbolic gestures. These were legitimate powerhouse partnerships built on deep trust and a shared, almost telepathic understanding of what real country music is supposed to sound like. When they finally stepped on stage together, the resemblance was absolutely spooky. The cowboy hats, the denim, the boots, it was like seeing a clone. But it was that unspoken ease and inherited swagger that felt genetic rather than rehearsed that really stole the show. Whenever father and son performed together, it never felt like a forced celebrity handoff under the bright lights. Instead, it was a quiet, chilling acknowledgement that the tradition was already alive and thriving in the next generation. Then came the moment the truth was finally confirmed for everyone to see. It was 2014 during the emotional final stop of the Cowboy Rides Away tour in Arlington, Texas. In front of a record-breaking, screaming crowd, Bubba walked out to join his father for Arkansas Dave, a song Bubba had actually written himself. It wasn't a dramatic pyrotechnic announcement designed to break the internet, nor was it framed as some theatrical passing of the torch, but for the insiders paying close attention, the message was loud and unmistakable. This wasn't the end of an era, it was the shocking confirmation of continuity. As the years rolled on, Bubba did something even more radical in today's fame-obsessed culture. He stayed ghost. He remained deliberately private, dodging social media, limiting public appearances, and choosing a quiet family life over the toxic glare of public exposure. Happily married to his wife Tamara and raising 2 children of his own, he is living the anti-Hollywood dream. He is mirroring the exact values George lived by prioritising presence over cheap publicity and choosing substance over the empty spectacle that ruins so many other celebrity families. Now in his 40s, Bubba has effectively confirmed what the die-hard fans whispered about for decades. The Strait legacy was never about finding a replacement for George, because let's face it, that's impossible. It was about preserving the sanctity of what he stood for. Country music in its truest form doesn't need a trendy reinvention. It needs respect. George Strait never built his legendary career by chasing clout or immortality. Yet he achieved it by staying brutally true to himself. His retirement from the touring circuit didn't signal a funeral for his career, but a calculated transition. It was a move that allowed space for reflection, family time, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing the job was done right. And through Bubba, that work continues. It is not a cheap imitation, it is an evolution grounded in the same ironclad principles: authenticity, restraint, and a near-religious reverence for tradition. This legacy isn't screaming for attention on the internet. It isn't loud. It simply exists steady and unshakable, much like the enigmatic man who built the foundation. In the end, George Strait didn't just leave behind platinum records, awards, or sold-out stadiums. He left behind a blueprint, a specific way of operating in a chaotic world. It is a powerful reminder that true greatness doesn't need to make noise, and that sometimes the most enduring legacies are the ones passed down in whispers and by example rather than through desperate announcements. The king may have stepped back from the centre stage, but the music, the values, and that untouchable spirit of pure country ride on. Steady, unbroken, and very much alive in the bloodline. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the real lives behind the legends, make sure to smash that like button, subscribe to the channel for more insider stories, and spill your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching The Truth Unfold. We will see you in the next video.